Jets fans, Winnipeg is still just kicking off its offseason, and so far, so good. The Jets have generally made a couple of big upgrades. They made a necessary move in trading Dubois, and they have moved out a couple of players who, while they were fun to watch, maybe didn't bring enough to the table. Wheeler, Menelainen, and Stenlund, despite having either really long and strong careers or, in the latter's case, a brief stay with the Jets, it was time to maybe make some adjustments and come back with a new group. We're going to try and predict next year's lineup on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Winnipeg fans, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is completely free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But most of all, we just really love and appreciate your support. Now, on tonight's episode, like I said, obviously the season is still a fair decent bit away, but, September, October is going to be upon us very quickly. The Jets are already talking about their young stars and training camp lineups, and so we're getting a sense that, it's time for the Jets to move forward, and one of those things that naturally comes up is a question of how this team is going to look next season. And I think this is one of those off seasons where the question is very much undecided as of yet. We don't even know if Scheifele and Hellebuyck are going to still be around by the end of this summer. My guess is yes, based on what we've heard so far, but it's really hard to tell, right? The market didn't seem to be as strong for either Helly or Scheifele as I think the Jets were anticipating, and so they might treat them as like internal rentals for at least part of the season. Now, given if, we're assuming that Scheifele and Hellebuyck stay around, but the lineup, let's start off with the first line. So thinking ahead to next season, I could see Connor, Scheifele, and Ehlers being a thing. I think this first line would be pretty good. The only question that I have is, Ehlers having to essentially do more of the offensive carrying because Connor and Scheifele do tend to spend a lot of their time pinned in the D zone, right? So if you have Ehlers moving up and down the ice and maintaining stronger puck control, in theory, that should keep the puck away from the goaltending tandem, whoever is in net. I just, kind of wonder defensively how this trio is going to work because we know that Ehlers isn't really a strong defensive forward, and it's not like he needs to be. As long as he keeps the puck up the ice, I think that'll benefit Connor and Scheifele. I would also wonder if Scheifele is going to have a rejuvenated season. If he does, and he's back to where he was at the start of last season, coming into this year, we could be in for a real treat, but I don't know what his buy-in is. That is kind of a big question for me because obviously Scheifele's buy-in was critical to his success last season, and then when it went away for at least half the year, it didn't look nearly as positive, right? So a big question mark there, but let's just assume that he's back and feeling, committed to what the Jets are trying to do, and assuming all of that pans out. That's a good first line. I think that'll get you quite a few goals. But then you get to the second line and you start wondering, okay, so given that, how are the Jets going to align the second unit? And this is where Winnipeg starts to have more options. So assuming Cole Perfetti is healthy and ready to go, I think he'll start out on the flanks here. And then you might see one of Vilardi or Namestnikov anchor that second line center role. I'm going to put money on Vilardi being the option here. Perfetti may also be this one. Either way, these guys are both going to play on the second line, I feel pretty sure. Now, I guess on the right wing side, you do have some choices. Maybe Niederreiter starts up there. You might also see Iafallo put up there if they want to reunite Gabriel and Alex together as a duo. I think that would bring some natural chemistry and maybe kind of help them acclimate to Winnipeg life a little bit more. And also, they just seem to have pretty good chemistry. So I feel like if you do that alongside Perfetti, who's a brilliant passer, you should have a really good second line. But if Namestnikov is there instead of Vilardi or instead of Niederreiter, I don't know who they would substitute out there. I think that would be a solid option. But I think if you're going to have Namestnikov in the top six, I'd prefer it to be alongside Ehlers. I think those two really worked well together. But then you kind of start to wonder, okay, well, who's playing right wing with Connor and Scheifele? Because you do have to be relatively careful. It's got to be somebody who can keep pace and also offer some more transition ability, because while Scheifele can do it and Connor does do it to an extent, Ehlers is just unmatched for all of them, and he really is a guy that you kind of want on your first line. The third line, again, you have some options. I, so far, am having Iafallo, Namestnikov, and Appleton there. Again, I mean, it really does depend on where they put Iafallo in reference to, I would say, Vilardi. I would imagine that he's either going to be on the second or third line. My guess is probably more towards the third. Namestnikov obviously is going to be a guy that they sort of flex in and out of the lineup, and probably bounce him up and down all over depending on situational need. But I think for like a third line, it's perfectly reasonable. Appleton's pretty decent. I mean, or at least was in previous seasons. I'm hoping like this next year is kind of a big jump for him, because last year wasn't so great. But either way, I mean, again, you have a couple of legitimate choices here. Not a ton, but some choices to rearrange these units. The fourth line, you could probably have like Barron, Lowry, Gustafsson, Kupari maybe joining on one of these units as well. I think this is kind of where there's a little bit of a logjam so far in figuring out which of these bottom six players really slots in. I mean, Harkins is another choice that probably won't make the Jets this season unless maybe Appleton gets moved. I feel like there are one or two guys in the current depth units that could probably do with a change of scenery. I do not want it to be Gustafsson. I still think Big Dave has a lot to offer this team, and I'd prefer that he stick around for at least a couple more seasons. But maybe he wants to move. I don't know. Either way, I feel like this team is going to be relatively decent. I don't know if they're going to finish top 3 in the Central necessarily, but in terms of a squad that could be like a wild card team, I think that's probably reasonable to expect. But obviously, there are a couple of things the Jets might be interested in. We'll talk about one or two needs that Winnipeg probably needs to take a look at here pretty soon. Before we go any further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right, just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for rejoining us on tonight's episode of Locked On Jets. We are talking about, obviously, Winnipeg's upcoming lineups, and, obviously the Jets are trying to figure out what they need exactly and how they can rearrange this unit to be more offensively potent, because last year finishing was kind of a problem. So assuming that the lineups that we just talked about are relatively accurate, I don't know that they are, but we'll assume that, it's reasonably close enough to where we can get a sense of what this team might look like. The big question for the Jets then becomes the back end, right? The defense is still kind of a question mark with who's going to stay and who's going to be moved out. The Jets probably need to offload some salary and free up some spots, because Declan Chisholm, I believe, is going to require waivers. They've got Logan Stanley also there. Ville Heinola is certainly a depreciating asset as it is right now. And Dylan Sandberg probably needs to take a more prominent role. But we have a huge logjam of defenders, all kind of playing very similar roles. Now, there are 3 names that I think are players that the Jets should potentially consider jettisoning, and whether they actually will is kind of a big question. My guess is no, except for one of them. Now, the first name that I think is probably the most expendable and the one that could be moved out is it's going to be Brendan Dillon. And that's not because Dillon's a bad player. Quite the opposite. Brendan's actually very defensively sound, and I think in terms of what he's done in a relatively shutdown role, he has kind of met all of his expectations, and he's been a very solid player. I think the problem for Brendan is that offensively, the Jets probably need a little more activity on that left side, and I don't know that Brendan has necessarily had that skill set. He's tried to grow his game, and I think He's made admirable strides in trying to be more active, getting into shooting lanes, and trying to be a better breakout passer. But we know that in general, that's not really his game. And I suppose when you're looking at Nate Schmidt, that used to be Nate's game, but I feel like over the past couple of years, he's definitely taken a step back. And I feel like the version of him that I thought the Jets might get really hasn't been present. He's just been kind of average. And when you're paying like what, 5.8 something million or closer to 6 million a season for him, it's just not really doing it in terms of value. So those guys I think could be moved. I think Dillon is probably the most appealing because his cap hit's not crazy and he actually brings positive value defensively. The other guy that I kind of wonder about long-term is Neil Pionk. And I know the team loves Neil. He's even been mentioned among some of the press materials regarding some of the recent draft picks because he's a Minnesota boy. You know, obviously they love that. Kind of homegrown in a sense, but not really, I guess, just a bit of a hop, skip, and a jump away when you consider how far he is from where Winnipeg is. And so Pionk, for me, a couple of seasons ago, I was very excited about him maybe starting to improve and become that solid second pairing guy, maybe even fringe first pairing. But it seems like over the past couple of seasons, ever since the bubble year, that really hasn't happened. He's taken a big step back and he's looked more like the New York Rangers version of Pionk than the bubble Jets version. And so at this point, you know, it might be better for the Jets to cut their losses and see if somebody would be interested in trying to turn his career around. Because as it is right now, he's really not making the strides forward that I had hoped. And it's tough to watch. I mean, it's clear that Pionk is very frustrated at times with his own performance. You can hear him be very vocal about it when he talks about accountability and how he feels on his previous seasons. And while it is, you know, great to hear somebody being honest and critiquing their own performances, unfortunately, it's not really changing. And so I feel like for the Jets and for Pionk, it might be better for them to have a bit of a change of scenery. But given his contract and given how much the Jets have played him and how much they seem to like him, I just don't really think he's actually on the way out. If he does get moved, it suddenly opens more competition for a pretty prime spot on this defense because the Jets definitely need more back-end mobility and skill. One thing that they've really struggled with on the blue line is passing out under pressure. Winnipeg's short and long passing is just really dreadful, and I think it has a really big impact on whether Winnipeg's forwards can push further up the ice. If you can't really trust that the puck is going to get through the neutral zone or even out of the defensive zone on a consistent basis, you're naturally going to have a tendency to drop your forward lines deeper, and I think for the Jets, that's been a big problem. Winnipeg has had to really, I would say, stifle its own creativity at times because the defense just wasn't really keeping up and able to provide enough support moving the puck up the ice. If they start to move some of these players and kind of reformat how this unit looks, I think that there's reason to believe this Jets team could be a lot more ambitious offensively next season. Already, I think they've made some good upgrades in a couple of finishing areas. Iafallo is going to be better than most of the bottom six at scoring. I think Vilardi is going to be pretty similar to what Dubois was doing in terms of box numbers. And Kupari probably has more offensive jump than Stenlund, although I will say Stenlund had surprising amounts of skill in terms of what he brought to the team. So overall, you know, it's not bad, right? But I do think the defense, with a couple of smart changes, could be a lot more aggressive and give Bones more than anything just more flexibility and options. I think right now the Jets are very locked into a certain setup, and that can be kind of a problem when you become predictable and everyone knows what your primary weaknesses are. Speed has definitely been something that this team has lacked. Hopefully the new skaters that are coming in can bring Winnipeg a little bit up to speed to like modern NHL skating levels. I think the Jets have definitely had that lack of foot speed, but hopefully they can generate more going forward and be more creative. But obviously for Winnipeg, you know, not only foot speed, but passing ability, finishing talent, all of that stuff, those are areas that they're really trying to work on and continue to improve. But so far, I mean, this offseason, I think they have shown at least a pretty good awareness of what they need to fix. The question is just how much further are they going to push in turning this team around? So in just a little bit, I'll give an overall grade for this offseason and what I think they've done well and where I see needs for signs of improvement. Welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for rejoining us on tonight's episode of Locked On Jets. We're just going to quickly wrap up as we close out today's episode with some thoughts on Winnipeg's offseason thus far and what kind of a grade I can give it. So based on the moves the Jets have made, by and large in free agency, it's been relatively quiet. Namestnikov re-signed for 2 years, pretty solid signing. I like it. I think he's a good player, and I think for the cap hit that they're bringing him back on, it's very reasonable. 2x2, so like a total of $4 million over 2 seasons. That's pretty darn nice value for a middle six player who I thought showed off enough skill to be pretty enjoyable and also has some defensive responsibility. Colin Delia obviously is just a guy who's either going to be for the Moose or potentially a backup down the road. I think he's fine for league minimum. Jeffrey Viel, I think his name is Viel, something like that. Another guy who I think will probably spend a lot of his time with the Moose. Brossoit coming back does feel kind of predictable in a way. I like Brossoit as a backup. He is a little expensive, I would say, for one season, but not expensive enough to where I'm really upset about the deal. It's just kind of like an okay, sort of contract, something where if he becomes the starter, you're not really too upset about it. But as a backup, I mean, it's a fair enough, reasonable deal, right? That's kind of how Winnipeg operates in free agency. It's just like reasonable deals, right? Nothing too crazy. Occasionally they get some really good steals like Gagne and Stenlund for like league minimum. They just re-signed Axel Jonsson-Fjallby a few hours ago for like 2 years at around $775K, which again, for a guy who will spend some time with the Moose and maybe with, some time with the Jets, I feel is very reasonable. But all of that's very minor. I would say in terms of like free agency, I'll give that like a B- or like a C+, just because the Jets definitely filled a need or two and addressed some depth concerns, but not really at a level to where I think it's very impactful. Now, on the trade side of things, the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade gets an A for me. I think that was phenomenal. I think the Jets got a lot of value out of it. And for that to literally only cost Dubois, and you got 3 roster players and a second-round pick next season, for me, is a bit of a masterclass. I think the Jets did great. I think given the circumstances and what we knew about Dubois' willingness to resign, I think Chevy really couldn't have gotten a much better package, especially given the focus on roster players. Now, you can argue that the direction the Jets should take should not be trying to be playoff competitive, but I'm not going to evaluate it that way right now. I think just purely from the perspective of the Jets trying to be competitive and being, playoff ready for next season, it's a good trade, right? They got great value. I think it's a very reasonable package and one that Jets fans should be pretty pleased with. Now, in terms of what's going on with Scheifele and Hellebuyck, I do kind of have questions about that. Those questions kind of make me wonder if I should dock the team necessarily for that, or if I should maybe give them more of a chance, I guess. I think I want to wait to assign a grade to that just because I don't know if the team is really convinced of retaining both players or if they're still planning to deal them at some point. I guess it depends on whether or not they even get extended. Hellebuyck, for me, would probably be the more likely of the 2 players who could get a contract extension, but I don't know about Scheifele. And it really depends on what their personal feelings are on the direction of the team and how they see the future of the Jets over the next 4 to 5 years. If I was them, I would probably be pretty mixed. I don't know that I would be very decisive just because it seems like Winnipeg keeps doing a lot of stuff halfway. I think the Dubois trade was very good, but I feel like the team might want to make a few more investments before either of Scheifele or Hellebuyck would feel comfortable committing long-term. And I'm not going to say that that's necessarily the best direction for the Jets either, but in terms of again, trying to stay competitive and be at a level where you're generating revenue, making playoff appearances, and consistently putting on stronger performances, I mean, it could be worse, right? I just hope that they don't lose either of those guys for nothing. I don't think that they will. I think that they will either re-sign or trade them at some point. It's just, you don't want to run into a situation where you're past the trade deadline and neither guy wants to extend and you didn't trade them at all. I think losing them for nothing would be a serious problem. So let's hope that they don't do that. I think the Jets have generally escaped danger before. I think the Dubois trade and, some of the other stuff like the Kane trade and a few others in between, the Trouba trade, they got reasonable value for. So I'd expect them to get reasonable value relative to expectations for either of Scheifele and Hellebuyck. They just kind of have to figure out, what it is that they want to do. So a lot of stuff to keep parsing through, but we will keep you updated as the Jets continue to make moves and make some more signings or trades, and we'll give you our thoughts on them as they pop up. But for today's episode, that is all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We will see you back here tomorrow with more offseason coverage, so stay tuned. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe. And as always, thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.